Hello and welcome to the third episode of The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Thank you to everyone who's listened to the podcast so far. We now have over 150 downloads in 14 countries. It's a fantastic start, but there's more to do. So, this week, it would be great if everyone listening could do one of two things. Either share the podcast with someone who you think might enjoy it, or, even better, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or whichever website you get your podcasts from. 5-star reviews and follows help The Hated and the Dead become visible to more and more people. The subject of this conversation is an important figure in world politics for different reasons. Firstly, he is one of the longest-serving heads of government in the world, having been in power for over 18 years. He is frequently compared to other nationalist leaders, such as Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. He is also currently conducting military campaigns in Syria, Libya and Iraq. By chance, he is also the first subject of The Hated and the Dead to be still in power at the time of recording. I am, of course, talking about Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who served as Prime Minister of Turkey from 2003 until 2014 and has since been that country's president. Why should you be interested in Erdogan? Well, the list of foreign countries he's invaded makes him the most dangerous person explored on The Hated and the Dead so far, and his bizarre transformation over the years from seemingly pleasant conservative to unpredictable despot makes for an interesting character study. My guest for today's podcast is the Times columnist and author Hannah Lucinda Smith. In 2019, Hannah authored and released the book Erdogan Rising, a fantastic account of the man himself, and indeed of a country deeply unsure of its identity and future. Our conversation touched on Erdogan's relationship with his country's secular past and his desire to erase it, the failed coup attempt against Mr. Erdogan in 2016, and his foreign policy. We also explored the concept of martyrdom in Islamic countries. I love this conversation, so, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
How's it going?
It's going well. Yeah, it's going well. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for agreeing to come on. I read your book, Erdogan Rising, last Christmas. I'm not sure I'd call it a festive read.
I was going to say, it's not very Christmassy at all.
but it's very enjoyable nonetheless. It's a very thorough account of this man, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's going to be the subject of our conversation today. You've been writing about Erdogan for a very long time. What do you want people in the West to know about this man? Why do you feel the need to write about him?
I think, as I kind of lay out right at the beginning of the book, it's very easy, I think, when you're looking at Erdogan from outside of Turkey, particularly from a Western country where we don't have this tradition of the strongman leaders, to sort of look at him and laugh and think that he looks a bit ridiculous and think, well, why would anyone support this guy? But the fact is, people do. He is still, right now he's at his lowest point in terms of popularity in polling that he's ever been. And yet he is still, I would say, as an individual, the most charismatic and the most sort of personally popular political figure in Turkey. And I think, Turkey is a country that the West has to deal with, both on a kind of bilateral level. Countries like the UK or the US have to deal with him. The EU has to deal with him principally because of the migration issue. Turkey is the place that the kind of wave of refugees came from in 2015. And Erdogan has openly used refugees to nudge the EU to do what he wants. NATO, of course, obviously Turkey is a NATO member. It's a very important NATO member. Much as people speculate about whether Turkey's going to leave NATO or NATO's going to kick Turkey out. That is just not going to happen, principally because of where Turkey is. So again, NATO has to deal with Turkey. America does on a bilateral level because of, America's Middle Eastern policy. So, this is a country that we have to engage with. And if you want to engage with it, you have to understand Erdogan's personality, his motivations, and the reasons for his continuing success.
I mean, that's quite a similar answer to a question I got about Silvio Berlusconi when I was doing a podcast on him last week. There's this sort of perception from the outside that he's a bit of a laugh, a bit of a clown, but actually somebody that needs to be taken very seriously in a way, because there's a lot of trends within the politics of these countries that are beginning to replicate within our own countries as well. I mean, if we just look at Erdogan for a second, he served as the mayor of Istanbul during the 90s. He was elected as Prime Minister of Turkey for the first time in 2002. People might be surprised to hear how long he's been on the political scene. His election in 2002 was quite a significant moment and an upending of the status quo in Turkey. Can you explain a bit about the politics of the Turkish state and the Turkish establishment before Erdogan arrived, and also perhaps introduce the fairly crucial figure of Ataturk?
Sure. Yeah, so obviously the Turkish Republic, it was founded in the kind of ruins of the Ottoman Empire in 1923 by Kemal Ataturk, who was a soldier turned statesman. Probably, I think, one of the only examples I can think of being a very successful soldier and a very successful statesman. You're usually either good at one or the other, right? But he sort of became known in Turkey for being the general that beat the British and the Anzacs at Çanakkale, or Gallipoli as we call it. Became a bit of a national hero for that. And then as the Ottoman Empire was kind of being picked apart and dismantled, both within and from the outside, he then slipped Istanbul, went to Anatolia, built a resistance movement, fighting against all the occupying powers that occupied various parts of the kind of disintegrating Ottoman Empire, fought and won back Anatolia, and then founded the modern Turkish Republic in 1923 with himself as the first president. And he really wanted to break in many ways, I'd say ideological ways, if not bureaucratic ways, from the Ottoman Empire. So the state that he founded was secular. He wanted to kind of take Islam out of the equation of Turkish politics, banish it to the private sphere, build a modern nation state. This was the kind of the Republican ideal, and for the next few decades, the elites, the political elites and the bureaucratic elites were people who were very much in Ataturk's image. Secular, Western-looking, modernising, saw the Ottoman Empire as kind of a bit of an embarrassment, might have been personally religious, but certainly didn't want Islam in the public sphere at all. Now, people see the rise of Erdogan and his party, the AKP, as the decisive break with that. Actually, Erdogan is just the kind of latest incarnation of a trend that began pretty soon, actually, after Ataturk died. Ataturk died in 1938. He was succeeded by İsmet İnönü, his kind of right-hand man. And pretty soon things started to, if you're talking to a true Ataturk devotee, they would say go wrong. Turkey's first democratic elections were in 1950, and they were won by an opposition party, the Democrat Party, led by a guy called Adnan Menderes, who immediately started rolling back some of these kind of secularizing reforms. So the really big one that everyone sort of remembers is that he reintroduced the Arabic call to prayer from Turkish mosques. That had been banned by Ataturk. It had been turned into Turkish, and this was kind of a big insult for the pious part of the society. Menderes did not last long. He lasted 10 years, and then he was overthrown by the army and hanged. So this was the first coup of the Turkish Republic, the first time that the army who saw themselves as the kind of guardians of Ataturk's legacy, stepped in to overthrow a political, democratically elected leader who they felt was going a little bit too far.
This is one of the odd things about the secularists, is that over the course of the 20th century, they've always been quite illiberal in enforcing their brand of secularism and Turkish nationalism. They banned the wearing of the burqa in the public places. Ataturk notoriously, I think, bombed the Kurdish provinces of Turkey because of the Kurds weren't particularly interested in this notion of the wider Turkish state. Erdogan, when he comes in some ways, is seen as more moderate.
Yeah. I think this is one of the big misconceptions about Turkey and the people who are now the opposition, the more secular part of the society. They're not liberal. You know, you can probably count the liberals, the true liberal politicians in Turkey on a few hands. I mean, it's changing slightly, but you know, this sort of liberal culture doesn't exist. I mean, it was the Ataturk followers see themselves as modernising. You know, their main kind of driver is to modernise Turkey, but they're quite willing to do that by liberal means. And you know, as you mentioned, that's what happened. You know, the complete banishing of religious symbols from public life. It's something that, you know, in the West, rightly, I think it would be considered very illiberal. You know, the fez was banned, you know, the traditional Ottoman hat, and people were hanged for wearing it in Ataturk's time. I mean, that's mad, right? So, you know, even up to the present day, when I talk to my friends in Istanbul who are in their late 30s, 40s, remember the time before the AKP, and you know, they say, well, the guys before were just as dogmatic, but in the other direction. You know, when they had the power, they were deeply illiberal as well. So this idea that, you know, just because they're secular, they're liberal, no, that doesn't work. But yeah, you're quite right. So when Erdogan and his party came in, yeah, I mean, Erdogan was the sort of latest in a long line of politicians with Islamist sympathies. His mentor politically was a guy called Necmettin Erbakan. But Erdogan and his party tried to sort of shake things up a bit. They weren't the kind of traditional Islamists. They took a pro-Western, pro-European, pro-market stance. This was the difference. And their really genius trick was to lump in the kind of struggle of Turkey's conservatives with the struggle of people like the Kurds, or with the struggle of people like, you know, secularists, but who were against military tutelage. So, you know, I think also by this point in Turkey, you know, a lot of people had been burned by these repeated military coups. It wasn't just the Islamists who suffered every time the army stepped in. It's also leftists, you know, people who were of a more liberal persuasion. You know, nobody particularly likes a military coup apart from the military, right? Sure. So, yeah, and, you know, Turks, I think, were kind of fed up with this, you know, this constant pattern of, you know, democratic governments and then a coup and then things being a junta for a bit and then going back to democracy for a bit. And what Erdogan and his party were promising was a Turkey that was going to go into the European Union, that was going to finally confront its really tortured history with the Kurds, which was going to kind of subdue the power of the military, and that was also going to strengthen the Turkish economy. I mean, at the point where the AKP won power in 2002, Turkey was in economic crisis. It got into hyperinflation. It had to be bailed out by the IMF. Quite a sort of extensive rescue package put in, and so that was the kind of, you know, complete chaos that the party emerged into. So, and you know, everyone was really enthusiastic about it. I mean, I think
read reports from the British and American press about this time, from the sort of mid to late 2000s, and even then, after a few years in power, he still had this kind of democratic, moderate, avuncular veneer about him in the press. And this begs a kind of lazy question on my part, I suppose, of what's happened. I mean, how did we get to where we are now? Because it's worth mentioning the extent to which Turkey has fallen backwards in terms of freedom and democracy in the last 20 years. I mean, it's got more journalists in jail than any other country in the world apart from China. I think it's toppled down to the sort of middle regions of the democracy index, and press censorship is very common, and indeed self-censorship is much more common. What's happened?
I don't think it's a lazy question. I think it's a very good question. It's one that I've spent nearly a decade trying to work out. I mean, if you talk to Erdogan's opponents, a lot of them will say, well, I've always opposed him and we always knew that he was like this and blah, blah, blah. And I don't quite believe that's true, because, he's never been overwhelmingly popular, but he has been popular enough at some points to keep on gathering support outside of what would be considered his natural base. So there was something in him. On the other hand, when you talk to people who are close to him, they say that he's always had this very, very stubborn, quite acidic streak. But it's very, very clear that, over time, I think my understanding of Erdogan is that he is a pragmatist. And he's very, very good at knowing and sensing what's going to be good for him at any particular time. So, back in the early 2000s, I think he sensed that the mood in Turkey was liberalising, and that the way that he could connect with voters was, like I say, by lumping in, the problems of the Conservatives, the repression of the Conservatives together with the repression of the Kurds, and win a kind of bigger base that way. Now, people say that insiders in Turkish politics say that he really began to change sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. So that was when there were trials within the military, the Ergenekon and Balyoz trials, which were pursued mainly by Gülenist judges. So the Gülenists were the group that later on, they're the ones who are accused of then going on to launch a coup against Erdogan in 2016. But back at that time, Erdogan and the Gülenists were very much allies. So people on the inside say that, that was about the time that, there were signs that things might be starting to change. And actually, when you look, I don't think his underlying character has necessarily changed. I think he's always, he doesn't hide this, it's always clear that he is a personally pious guy. Islam and God are very important to him, that's for sure. I think it's always been the case that he's wanted to change Turkish society somewhat to make it more pious, although in the early days he knew very well that he couldn't go straight in and do that. But yeah, I think there are also certain events that have changed him and made him more paranoid and more acerbic and more difficult to deal with. One of which, of course, was the Gezi Park protests in 2013. So this was the first time that there'd really been a kind of mass street-level opposition to him. And I think what people often don't know or tend to forget is that came at a point where things were going wrong for him elsewhere as well. So, the spring of 2013, obviously the Syrian war was rumbling on. Turkey was basically on the same side at that point as the US and the UK and various of the Western countries who were backing the opposition against Assad. But that was just beginning to change, because we were at that point seeing the rise of extremist groups and the emergence of ISIS in northern Syria. A lot of people blaming Turkey for that, either for complicity or for turning a bit of a blind eye as these foreign jihadists were going across the Turkish border into Syria. And literally just before the Gezi Park protests erupted, Erdogan had been in Washington talking with Obama, and Obama had basically made it clear that, the US wasn't going to be supporting the armed opposition while this was going on, and told Erdogan to sort out this problem of the jihadists going into Syria. So, people who are on that trip say that, Erdogan came back from Washington feeling like the US wants to overthrow me, and then he comes back and what's the first thing that happens? Gezi Park protest. And then the next thing that happens in very quick succession is the coup in Egypt. Egypt was, of course, up until that point, the big, in inverted commas, success story of the Arab Spring. It was, the biggest country where you had a Muslim Brotherhood government, of which Erdogan is very much an ideological fellow traveller in power, with Erdogan having a lot of influence, a lot of goodwill there, and it's overthrown by military coup. So, and that's the point as well, that I think the Arab Spring really just kicked into reverse. Things were going wrong in Syria. He'd gone really quickly from being the leader of a country that was seen as, the future model for the Middle East. So it's so weird to think about that now, right? But, back in the early days of the Arab Spring, everyone was sort of looking to Turkey as a possible model for how you blend Islam and democracy, and how you can have, an Islamic government but still sticking to democratic norms. And suddenly all that's going, and that was a massive turning point. Another massive turning point was in June 2015, when his party failed to get an outright majority in parliamentary elections for the first time. That led to him forming an alliance with the hard nationalists, which then in turn led to the unravelling of the peace process with the Kurds, the rebooting of the war with the Kurds, and then, of course, the 2016 coup attempt.
Well, this sort of everything sort of leads up to this coup attempt, which in many ways is fairly emblematic of a lot of the secularist coups that had happened before. Just go into the details a bit, if you don't mind, about what happened in 2016, because I think it's probably the most significant point of his time in power. And it's the event that you start the book with, I think.
Yeah. The coup, it happened in July 2016. It happened in the middle of an incredibly turbulent period that had started, a year before with those parliamentary elections. Basically, there was a terror attack almost every month for that year in Turkey, both by ISIS and by the PKK, the Kurdish militia. Some of them just horrifically bloody. I mean, in October 2015, a double suicide bombing at a peace rally in Ankara killed more than 100 people. There was an attack at Ataturk airport that killed about 50 or 60 people, I think. It was a really turbulent time to be in Turkey. Tourists all left, and we could kind of feel as journalists, and also, talking to my Turkish friends, they were saying the same thing, that something was coming. We definitely didn't expect that something to unfold in the way it did. So on a Friday night, 15th of July 2016, at about 9 o'clock at night, all of a sudden the army blocked the main bridge in Istanbul. F-16s started flying low over Ankara. We all kind of wondered what was going on for a few minutes, and then it became very clear that it was a coup attempt. Erdogan was on holiday at that point. He was in Marmaris. He special forces soldiers, coup soldiers, broke into his hotel and tried to kill him, but he'd escaped. But quite quickly that coup was crushed. It became quite clear quite quickly that it was not a kind of a unified act by the army. It was a faction within the army. Various high-ranking generals started coming out on television and saying, we're not part of this, we're against this. And, by dawnbreak the next morning, it had basically been crushed with a huge amount of, damage done, 250 people killed, parliament bombed. Erdogan came back, gave a speech to crowds on the tarmac at Ataturk airport, and I mean, on one level looked very much like he was back in charge. It was quite telling that he didn't actually go back to Ankara for about a week after that. He stayed in Istanbul, which he very much considers, I mean, it's his home city, it's where he became mayor, he considers it his kind of power base. Stayed in Istanbul for a week, sort of going around and giving speeches, etc., etc. Now, obviously, Turkey is not a place where you can very easily do investigative journalism. So we still don't fully know, what the kind of origins of that coup group were, but to the best of our knowledge, and there's a European intelligence document which supports this idea, is that it was Gülenists at the core of it, but they also attracted other officers who were just maybe anti-Erdogan, secularists, sort of opportunist officers. But it does seem to be that they were Gülenists at the core of it. However, the post-coup purge has just ensnared so many people at this point. Nowhere near all of them had something to do with the coup. And the other thing that the intelligence report says is that, although the coup was real, Erdogan already, and the intelligence services already had, lists of opponents who they wanted to round up. And the coup was a very good pretext for that.
I think the way he deals with this, it's kind of typical of his paranoia. In a way, I think it's very interesting because it shows you the way that he deals with other foreign leaders as well. And I want to come on to his foreign policy in a second. But probably the most important result of this 2016 coup is the referendum that takes place the following year. What are the changes that take place as a result of this referendum?
Yeah, so the constitutional referendum was held in April 2017. It was at a time when Turkey was still under state of emergency. Broadly, what it did was it shifted Turkey's political system from parliamentary to presidential. Executive decision-making was shifted from the parliament to the presidency. So until that point, actually on paper, the president should have been purely ceremonial, not political. And Erdogan had so he stood down as prime minister in 2014 to stand as president in what were the first presidential elections, because actually until that point, the president had just been selected. Yeah. And they were always very kind of like grey figures. They weren't very exciting, but that was sort of the point, right?
I guess it's kind of like the German system, right? Or the Italian.
Yeah, exactly. Certainly nothing like the French system or the American system. But yeah, I mean, Erdogan stood in and won the first presidential elections, and although he left his party officially in order to do that, in reality he was always still head of that party, and he was always still political. He never backed off from politics really. But what this referendum did, and it was passed very narrowly and contested, by the way. I mean, a lot of people rightly think that it wasn't fair at all, is that it did away with the job of prime minister. So Turkey doesn't have a prime minister anymore. You still have the parliament, but you have an executive presidency. So the president can basically rule by decree. He handpicks his cabinet. Yeah, so, I mean, in theory, the parliament develops laws and then the president signs them off. But the AKP, his party, also controls the parliament in its coalition with the MHP. It also gave the president quite extended powers over the judiciary. So the top judges are picked sort of half by the parliament and half by the president, pretty much. Yeah, and it's also allowed him to rejoin his party. So that was one of the first things he did. A month after that referendum, I went to their congress in Ankara, and it was the congress where they were going to be selecting the head of the party. I mean, there was only him standing, and it was like this homecoming gig. I mean, it was incredible. There was young guys there, sort of waving scarves and singing and chanting. It was absolutely bizarre. But yeah, so we've now basically got a system where Erdogan rules by decree. More than that, I mean, he's got such control over the institutions, and such control over other things like, the media. The media is so cowed at this point, at least the traditional media, that, really it's a one-man show in some senses. I think, any kind of undemocratic system or illiberal or dictatorial system, there's always the figurehead at the top who both symbolically and tangibly has the most power, but it's never just about them, right? And like same in Turkey, there are competing power bases within Erdogan's palace, but we have a system now where, the ministries, which had already had quite a lot of power taken away from them, are basically castrated because they're all sort of, second guessing him. The bureaucracy is second guessing him and what he wants. And, in tandem with that, his inner circle has really shrunk. I think that goes along with being increasingly paranoid as well. We do something similar to criminology quite a bit these days. It's interesting to look and see who's accompanying Erdogan on the trips, who's sitting closest to him. A lot of, old, towering figures from his party. In fact, almost all of them have left, his co-founders, but even other figures who until quite recently were seen as, quite loyal and quite powerful have been shunted aside to some extent. I'm thinking of a guy called Ibrahim Kalin, who's his spokesman, who is very erudite to talk to, very pleasant, very reasonable. He's a very kind of presentable face, and who was always seen as, quite a powerful figure, but he seems to have been shunted aside by a guy called Fahrettin Altan, who is the director of communications, who's really had a sort of rapid rise to power since 2018. Utterly inept, but has somehow got Erdogan's favour. We think because Fahrettin Altan oversaw the whole Jamal Khashoggi case. He oversaw all the leaks to the media, managed to make Turkey look quite good, or at least not the bad guy.
I mean, presumably the metric by which he chooses these people is loyalty above anything else. Right.
And that's one of the interesting things about Altan. I mean, if you look at kind of Camp Erdogan or the palace, let's say, usually like people have their own ambitions, or for example, like Süleyman Soylu, the interior minister, who was very powerful until quite recently. He's got his own ambitions. He's got his sort of connections with his own faction within the party. Altan hasn't. He's just all about loyalty to the boss.
Yeah.
One person inside the party said to me, he's spending more time with Erdogan every day than he is with his wife. Right. So yeah, that you're quite right. I think that's the metric at this point. But of course, that doesn't make for particularly good government, because then you're surrounded by yes men.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I just want to, as I've got a couple more questions just before we finish. I want to talk about his foreign adventures. He's done quite a lot in his time in power on the world stage. I mean, he's involved himself in the war in Syria, as you said, that it borders Turkey. There have been times when it looks as if he's going to have a standoff with Greece in the Eastern Med. How would you characterise his foreign policy? Because characterisations of his policy abroad range from him being sort of a civilizational leader who's trying to reconstruct the Ottoman Empire, on the one hand, to him basically just being an opportunist who doesn't really like the Americans and basically just wants Turkey to be sort of non-aligned and independent in its policy, but isn't really interested in making it into like a regional hegemon. Where do you stand on that spectrum?
I would go more towards the opportunist sense, but for different reasons. So I think, like, going back, like, one of the things about Erdogan is he's never been particularly sophisticated when it comes to foreign policy. He's not a worldly guy. He's, in a Turkish sense, he's incredibly street smart. He's brilliant when it comes to understanding the Turkish people. But, one of the really kind of striking things that someone from his party told me was, back in the early days when he still understood his own limitations, he would really take advice from other people about, foreign meetings with foreign leaders, and he would take notes, and he would go into these meetings with note cards, and he would, he understood his limitations. But yeah, a lot of those people clearly have either been purged or have moved away from the party. He's not got that kind of expertise surrounding him anymore. But more than that, what he's done in the last few years is he's really been using foreign policy as a tool for domestic ends.
Yes.
So there's been a total pattern, particularly since 2015, of every time he's either going into an election or a referendum, or things are looking a bit shaky, or the economy is going bad, or whatever, a foreign crisis is just manna for him. So, particularly operations against the Kurdish forces in Syria, very good for rousing a bit of support. Anything to do with Cyprus, fantastic. Greece as well, anything against Greece, and that's, where Libya comes into it. People might think, like, oh, why Turkish troops in Libya? But actually, you look at the maritime agreement that was done between Libya and Turkey, and that's all about, Turkey's claimed Crete as its own, basically, in that agreement. So, you can sort of usually fit all these things into a kind of domestic narrative. Now, the thing is, it has been very effective, but it's been diminishing returns. I think people are getting really, kind of sick of this constant, narrative of, battles against whoever. One thing I will say is that Turks do seem to have an incredibly high tolerance for soldiers coming back in coffins, which I still find strange. When you think of, like, the outrage that you get in Britain when we go into foreign wars and our soldiers start dying, people don't like it at all. Whereas in Turkey, there is a far more of a kind of cult of martyrdom. The word shahid, martyr, is used absolutely unironically. It's a very commonly used word.
Why do you think that is?
It's one of the really, really interesting things, right? So the army was like this kind of, the bastion of secularism. And yet at the same time, it's not an army that's completely divorced from Islam. So I remember asking, like, a former soldier once, why do you use this word shahids? And he's like, well, you have to believe in something if you want men to go and die for you. And what we believe in is that you become a martyr and there's something beyond this life. And in order to believe that, you have to believe in God. So
there's a lot of religious imagery there.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, like, recently, in Erdogan's time, particularly in the past 5 years, that overt Islamist imagery has come back into it. So, for example, until quite recently, at soldiers' funerals, they used to play, is it Chopin's funeral march? And now they've changed that, so it's an Islamic piece of music. I can't remember the name of it. It's never been entirely divorced. Like, this is the thing that's quite complex about Turkish secularism. It doesn't mean atheism. And certainly, the military people that I know in Turkey, especially like the old school types, say, like, we don't talk about politics, we don't talk about religion. Like, these are taboos in the barracks.
So it means separation.
It's separation, exactly. Yeah. So those things might be taboos for conversation, but when your comrade dies, you will gather around and pray and say the namaz, and, so... Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the notion of the shahid, I mean, it's also very big in the Arab world as well, not just for soldiers, but, whenever in Syria, I always got quite... maybe disturbed is the wrong word, but it was something that I could never quite come to terms with. It was when a child died in a bombing and they would referred to this child as a Shahid, as a martyr, and I was like, well, martyr to what? But that's not how it's seen in Islamic culture. As a Westerner, in particular, as like an atheist Westerner, I just can't get my brain around it. I can intellectually try and understand it, but on a kind of, I can't feel it. It sounds so weird as well in English, right? Like, to say, oh, he's a martyr.
You mentioned the diminishing returns that Erdogan's getting from his foreign adventures. It kind of leads me to my last question, which is, he's definitely the most powerful politician in Turkey. He's solidified his dominance through the referendum in 2017. But the economy and the currency is very weak. The country's still politically very divided. And Erdogan's managed to get the army involved in quite a lot of these foreign conflicts. If he is deposed, or if he does eventually lose an election and he's ejected from power, why do you think that will happen? What do you think the reason for that will have been?
I mean, there's a number of options. First and probably least likely is, fully fair and free elections and a democratic transition. For various reasons, I can't see that happening. Up until quite recently, I mean, this is probably far too kind of, insider baseball to get into, but until quite recently, the Interior Minister, Suleyman Soylu, looked like a very strong potential competitor for the throne. He's been sort of neutralised, but there's always the possibility of another figure from the sort of more nationalist part of the party or the coalition with the MHP rising up. One thing that could happen, so, if the parliament collapses, if the ruling coalition in the parliament collapses, then both parliamentary and presidential elections could be called. So here's the problem. Donald Trump would have loved to have been ruling in Turkey, because when he refused to recognise the election, but did it in America, unfortunately for him and fortunately for the rest of us, America's got independent and strong institutions. It's got an independent and strong legal system, media can stand up to him. Turkey doesn't have that at this point. The problem is that the institutions are largely under the control of Erdogan, right? So, that was demonstrated during the local elections in 2019 when the opposition won Istanbul, but thanks to political pressure, the Supreme Electoral Board overturned the results and just recalled the election. Now, as it turned out, the opposition then won again by a hugely increased margin, but that shows that your institutions are not functioning as they should be. So this is why I'm cynical about there being a totally free and fair election and, results being respected if they don't go Erdogan's way. Some people will ask about the possibility still of a coup. I mean, I think Erdogan's still paranoid about that. It was quite striking that during the forest fires a month and a half ago in Turkey, a lot of people were saying, where's the army? The army just didn't come out of their barracks to help fight those fires. And, talking to sort of people who've been purged from the military, what they said is they think that Erdogan is still paranoid about having the soldiers out in front of the people and winning the kind of affection of the people for any reason. And I think that there could be something in that. But, I just can't see how there could be a coup at this stage. The military's been so purged, particularly the top ranks.
Given Turkish history, he's more likely to be taken out by a coup than by an election.
That's what Turkish history shows, right? But I think, Turkey's really changed, and, the military is not what it used to be at all. And there's a lot to be said for that. It wasn't necessarily a terrible ambition of Erdogan's to decrease the power of the military. I mean, it's...
No, well, having the army as the arbiter of one particular ideology in a country seems like it could do an awful lot of damage in any system.
Absolutely. And, you know, the period that people always compare current Turkey to, as in saying, like, do you think it's worse now than, is always the post-1980 coup period. It was really dark, you know, the military took control, imprisoned thousands of people, a huge brain drain from the country, everything sort of, huge censorship, you know. I remember, God, it feels like a different era. It must have been 2013 or 2014. There was an exhibition in one of the galleries in central Istanbul which showed like various artifacts from that 1980s junta era, and there were like soft porn magazines, but with everything, you know, blanked out, and you know, in every you know, for every film you'd have a general who was kind of sitting in deciding what bits weren't compliant. You know, it's terrible. You know, the idea that, you know, a military coup would be a great democratic way to get, no, I just, no, it would be horrible. It would be absolutely awful. And, you know, even now, the overwhelming majority of people in Turkey are so happy that that coup didn't succeed in 2016. You know, it's just not a good place to be, you know. Having said that, we're basically living in a post-coup era now because of, you know, the huge amount of roundups and purges. I mean, it's basically what happens after a coup anyway, right? But it's just that the guy in charge stayed in charge. But yeah, I mean, I have to say, like, particularly in Istanbul, because we've had an opposition local council now since 2019, and the city has definitely changed. And people are quite hopeful about the elections, which are scheduled for 2023. You know, they see that Erdogan is looking quite weak. They, you know, they really think that there could be a, you know, normal democratic transition. I think that would depend a lot on what the opposition could offer Erdogan in that case. I think if the opposition are really smart, they will be looking at something that they can offer Erdogan to assure him that there's not going to be sort of huge punishment meted out on him and his family. It's going to be difficult to do. I mean, this is a really divided country at this point. And I think certainly there's going to have to be a huge amount of truth and reconciliation work going on when the Erdogan era is over, both, you know, restorative justice for the people who have suffered. Also, you know, there's going to have to be another rearrangement of the state because, you know, there's so many people at the moment who've got their jobs in the bureaucracy through loyalty, not just the high levels, like every level down. So, you know, it's going to take real statesmanship and political skill to manage that. But yeah, I mean, I think if the opposition was smart and they, you know, if their focus is a peaceful, smooth transition, then the best thing they could probably do is give Erdogan a guest out, immunity from prosecution or something. But I mean, how that would fly with Turkish people, I don't know.
Very interesting. There's still so much to come for Erdogan and sort of the way out of the bind that the whole country's got itself into. Hannah, it's been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Where can people find your work? Where can people read you?
So I write very regularly in the Times, which you can obviously find online. I tweet at Hannah Lucy, that's with an I at the end. You can read my book, Erdogan Rising, which is out in hardback and paperback. Yeah, where else? I think that's it. That's my main outlet.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to get updates whenever new episodes are released. If you're just on that last stretch of your commute to or from work, or have a spare 2 minutes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's the best way to help the podcast grow.